All right, everybody. Happy noon hour to everyone out there. This is Dan Binkin with Advance Iowa here at the University of Northern Iowa. We're glad you could join us today at noon. We're going to be talking about incentive compensation tools, golden handcuffs. I'll be referring to them often as, and Scott will as well. My presenter colleague today is Scott Sernett with SJS Consulting. He's been a wealth planner for the last 20-some years here in the Cedar Valley area. But before I get into that, what I really want to talk about is Scott's football career. And if any of you are familiar with UNI football, you've heard of Kurt Warner, to be sure. And lo and behold, Scott was Kurt's backup. So
one of them.
Back up to a Hall of Famer, MVP, not bad. I'm going to say that right now. I'm pretty impressed. So also we want to give a shout out to Benjamin Sernett, who's turning 16 today.
That's right. So, watch out on the streets of Cedar Falls.
Be careful out there. Scott, you want to kind of get us started then, and we'll start in here on handcuffing our key employees and why that's a good idea?
Certainly, Dan. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Ringing in from beautiful Cedar Falls. The snow is melting, and looked like a little bit of a winter wonderland this morning as the trees were white from the fog. So we're going to talk about incentive compensation tools and why it matters and what you need to know today. And so first, let's start with a little bit of on what our game plan is for the day. First, we'll start with a little introduction and my background, as well as some of the concerns that you might have when we talk about this people function, as I like to think of it. I think of it as people and performance on your teams. And then we'll get into some of the content. What are golden handcuffs? What do we mean by that? Why does it matter to you? Some of the assumptions that need to come into play as you think about this topic. We'll get into some terms and types of plans, how these plans get used by businesses, and some other considerations, and then finally costs and how to get started. And then we'll give you a case study example of one that we've worked on that's pretty popular, and we'll have a little time for Q&A at the end, and we have a special offer at the end as well. So that's kind of our agenda for the day. Does that sound good, Dan?
That sounds perfect.
Okay. So first of all, as Dan mentioned, I probably shouldn't have given him all that intel about me, but I'm a business owner myself and have been for over 20 years. And I mention that because I think most of the folks on the call are owners or centers of influence for businesses.
Correct.
And so I understand some of the demands of people and performance myself. Also, over 20 years have consulted business owners and families, and from small companies, first-generation family businesses to companies all the way up to 100 million plus of revenue, ESOPs and various things as well. So I have two companies, Sernett Wealth Management, which is a financial advisory firm here in town. And that's not what we're here to talk about today.
Right.
But we also have a business consulting company. SJS Consulting is a legal name, and Visilex is our marketing name. We offer succession and exit planning services, valuation and benchmarking, growth and value building, and the topic we're talking about today, key person incentive planning. So hopefully that means that I'm qualified to give this talk.
Absolutely.
And so enough about me. What concerns do people have around this topic? Well, certainly, and this is not an economics talk today, Dan, but
please no.
For sure, the economy is good and growing, and that means that people are concerned about rewarding and retaining their top employees. It's competitive out there, and whereas this is always important, I think, as we've discussed, Dan, it's probably more important now because there's growth in the economy.
Oh, yeah. Unemployment at under 3%. Basically, anyone who's hireable is already hired. So
That's
how
right.
do we keep the good ones that we've got?
That's right. And most companies' best employees are other companies' best prospects,
Yep.
prospective employees.
Yep.
So there's a competitive atmosphere out there. Also, it's expensive to lose key employees, and it can be difficult to measure that cost, but we know it's, I've had it happen personally, so I can speak to this, and, it does have an impact on the business.
Sure.
And it can also impact the ownership. So, at the end of the day, if someone's gone, the owner might have to work more. And most of our owner clients are looking to work less, not more.
Right.
So those are some of the things that we hear from our clients that why this topic is of interest to them.
Yep.
Okay, so what are golden handcuffs? Some people have heard this term and others have not. It's a term that we give loosely to plans that are designed to reward and retain key employees. Generally, these plans are considered what we call non-qualified, and that's as compared to qualified. So that means simply that these are the plans that you can do some discrimination. They're actually designed for a select group of employees, largely the key employees.
What are they non-qualified for?
Well, that's kind of a tax term, I guess you could say. So it just is a differentiation that you can do some picking and choosing within the employee base as opposed to having to provide the same thing to everyone.
Okay, perfect.
So, okay. Why does it matter to you? Why is this a relevant topic? Well, as we just mentioned, it's competitive out there. But also, the first question here is, anyone that's ever lost a key person in their organization will know why this matters. Because it hurts
Absolutely.
to lose key employees. It can have a material impact on the business and the ownership group. Obviously, lost revenue and key accounts. And this can take, it may not be just a matter of months, but could span over several years.
Oh, sure. I think you could argue that the cost structure, which I know we'll get to toward the end of the presentation, but those upfront costs and ongoing costs of putting together a key employee, a handcuffing plan, are far less than they are when you watch your business development manager walk out the door and have to replace him or her longer term, right?
For sure. When you think about the opportunity cost of losing a key employee or a key client relationship or a key manager, those costs can be significant. So that's kind of, point number one. Obviously, when you're down someone, it's more stress and workload for everyone else that remains, right?
Yep.
And we have seen some of this as well with companies that maybe have had to do some restructuring or downsizing. It just puts additional burden on the remaining employees and the ownership group. Or if, you're founder Frank on founder Frank.
Yeah.
Trade secrets and intellectual property or IP can walk out the door to the competition. There can be a value reduction for the company. This gets into more of down the road at succession or exit.
Sure.
Where if some of the next buyer might be concerned about the riskiness of the business if those key relationships and management folks aren't retained. And then also there could be a value reduction for the company if you're looking at, again, for a sale, just with the revenue. What happens if the revenue goes down? That you can get in this timing element that causes problems.
Sure. Or if I'm coming in to buy your company, and I know we'll talk about this a little later, but if I get the sense that the key employees aren't sticky or have recently left, you're talking about that, I guess, but our valuation is considerably dinged by those kinds of things.
That's a good reason in their mind for a big discount.
Right. Absolutely.
Right. And then also, again, these later bullet points get into sort of succession and exit planning topics, but the need for a strong and emerging management leadership team, we find, is one of the big challenges that companies have of all sizes.
Yep.
The larger companies tend to have a structure in place to manage this more effectively, but it's one of the first things that those buyers look for. And if everything revolves around the owner or a few of the owners, when those owners are gone, it has an impact.
Yeah.
So, and then lastly, and we've actually seen this as well, where having a key employee that maybe there isn't a clear path to the exit for the ownership, they might take off, or if they don't see their future, or they don't have any buy-in per se or a path to that, they take off, and now the owner's ready to execute this exit plan. They might be forced to wait another 3 or 5 or 7 years.
Sure.
So those are the things that, as we think about why does this matter to people, some of the things are really obvious, and some of them are not so obvious.
Oh, yeah.
Like these latter points that
these longer term considerations, like selling the company down the road. Absolutely.
That's right. Okay.
How about in general, as far as, can we do this for every employee in our company? You know, how do we start to look at who fits the mold and who doesn't fit the mold?
Yeah, great question. So no, these plans are generally not designed for all employees.
Okay.
That's where some of the other benefits and things that the company offers or should be offering come into play. So for example, we put in here, what are some things that companies, we need to see or should be present before they consider these types of things?
Okay, so we're talking kind of the baseline must-have to play ball type of thing?
That's right. So sort of the pay-to-play that should already be in place would be that employees, these folks are key to the company. They generally are highly compensated, and we put that in quotes. In various markets, in rural markets in the Midwest, it may be different than in
sure, it's not a set number,
for example.
Yep.
Where the compensation ranges vary.
Mm-hmm.
But you can think of it in terms of maybe the overall employee base. It should be towards maybe the top
those higher on the
25%
ladder
or so.
Yep.
These are designed for those folks. That there's already a good competitive base salary in place. That they also have good benefits, group health and 401ks, and those things are already in place.
Mm-hmm.
And also, we generally see that these are for more tenured employees. It's not the folks that are just starting,
Okay.
unless it's a part of a recruitment incentive package. So we find some companies, they want to, have this built and have it in place for some of their employees. So then as they're adding employees in the future, they're competing with maybe larger companies,
Mm-hmm.
that they can, use it as a bullet point on that they may be eligible for something like this as time goes on.
Sure. And those that are maybe at their competitive companies where they're hiring from and don't have these golden handcuff programs in place, or they're losing them because of these types of things.
Correct. And we've also seen it come into play where smaller companies, maybe in more rural areas, are trying to compete with larger companies, maybe, in towns where there are more people and they're within 30 or 60 miles of.
Sure.
That they might be competing for talent for.
Absolutely.
So it's a way to create a flexible package that maybe a larger company doesn't offer.
Okay.
That might be attractive to employees.
Yep.
But otherwise, it's usually for more folks that have been around the company for a while. Also, that there's some sort of short-term plan in place. These plans do not trump, or we don't think of them coming into place of a short-term cash bonus, whether it's quarterly or annual or whatever, where they're just getting cash, because of
hitting sales goals or production goals
or other metrics.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Those things are, because these are really more long-term.
Yep.
Medium to long-term incentive.
And we're talking
plans.
more than a year, but less than a lifetime type of
Correct.
thing, right?
That's right.
Okay.
Also, we put in work-life balance and enjoyment. So again, I think the point we're trying to make here, and also mutual vision for a positive future together, that the employee sees that this is a place that they want to be. None of these plans, I guess what we're trying to get to here is that nothing that we can do in this space will guarantee, of course, that someone will stay somewhere forever.
Right, right.
And in this day and age, generationally, it's sort of naive to think that way.
Yeah.
But we think when taken in concert with these other things, largely the things that we see people are generally doing anyway,
Mm-hmm.
this is the piece that has a reward and retention function, unlike a lot of these other basic things. So we use the analogy sometimes as well of putting glue in their seat.
Yeah.
So is there a way that we can reward and incentivize key employees to stay and to help drive the growth of the company?
Okay. So this is kind of on top of everything else, basically, right?
That's correct.
And really, if we don't have those baselines met, we're probably not going to have a lot of highly compensated employees, and we're not going to have a lot of long tenured employees, because we're going to have high turnover, right?
Probably. And if a lot of these things aren't in place already, companies probably aren't ready for a golden handcuffs plan.
Gotcha. Okay, great.
Okay. There generally are two broad camps that these plans fit into. And our goal today is not to make folks an expert on these various options, but to at least give a high-level overview of them. So on the left, we have equity-based plans, non-voting stock, for example, and stock purchase plans. we find that those types of plans generally are in place at larger companies, I think is fair to say. And it's also probably more for folks who are, either likely or already part of a succession or exit planning process.
Where they've identified their successor,
yes.
I assume, right?
Yes.
Or successee.
Correct.
Okay.
And the reason we see for that is that many owners are hesitant to either give or bonus or sell pieces of the company to employees, at least early on, because of lots of other things that can happen and other consequences that gets into. For example, opening up the books to them, for example. If it's a pass-through entity, distributions going to them pro rata. So it gets into a host of other things. And then if it doesn't work out,
basically
getting that
now
back
employees know what I'm
also,
making, right?
There's that, yes. And if it doesn't work out, then getting that back can be a real challenge.
Sure.
And so I guess what I would say there in our experience is that largely the equity-based parts we're seeing them more for larger companies or for folks that are sort of into some sort of formalized succession plan already.
Sure.
And or maybe they're family members and it's been part of a gifting
program that's been around.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, because the other part of that is control too, right? I mean, even at 5% of ownership, I have ownership now, founder Frank, and so
most owners like to maintain control in our experience, and so that's one more reason they don't like to get into the equity-based until maybe they're, towards the end or in a formal succession process.
Okay, so knowing that, kind of what camp are we in then, Scott? What are we looking at?
Yeah, so on the other side then we've got non-equity-based, and there are a variety of this is not an all-inclusive list, but touches on some of the most popular plans. And there's also this range of simple to complex. So my mentor used to say that our only limitation with these plans is our imagination. And there are rules, of course, but largely we can design plans around whatever the company's goals are.
Okay.
So at the top here, and non-equity tends to be, in our experience, where we start. So the owner doesn't want to give up equity.
Right.
They're not quite sure where all this will go, yet they want to reward and retain a key employee and maybe help drive the performance of the company.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we start with this
they're not even in the exit planning path yet. They're just in the
Correct.
Performance path and the keeping who I've got that's
Correct.
good.
In other words, how can I maintain control of all the stock and still put glue in the seats?
Right, and still try to control these people too to some extent.
Right, and grow the company. So we spend a fair amount of time in the non-equity based, or that's where it tends to start at least.
Yeah.
And so, for example, we have bonus plans, and there are different types of bonus plans. I mentioned short-term incentives before, and that's just your basic. You give them a cash bonus at the end of the quarter or the end of the year, or whatever metric it is. But there's no reward or retain function with that.
Okay.
So there are things out there called stay bonuses.
Okay.
And these do have retention functions.
And when you say retention, you're talking about probably vesting schedules?
Well, it can be vesting, or it can also be just a time-based award. So, for example, maybe there is a succession or an exit plan that's starting to happen.
Yep.
And you want to make sure that you keep these employees on through that transition.
Correct.
And so a stay bonus can be a way that says, if you stay or you do X at this point in the future, then we're going to pay you Y.
Okay.
And so that can be tends to be more of a short term, maybe a matter of months or a few years.
Do you see that tied to performance as well? So I'm thinking about a smaller firm. A lot of times a handcuffing approach is going to be done to key salespeople, those that are kind of turning on the spigot for the pipeline. And if Andy is my key salesperson and I'm selling the company to Sue, I want to make sure that Andy is working just as hard for Sue as he did for me or thereabouts, or Sue as a buyer is going to want to make sure that can we tie some performance attributes to our stay bonus programs?
Certainly.
Okay.
But if you look at the next bullet point where we talk about medium and long term,
now
we get into more of what we call a restricted bonus approach.
Okay.
So the stay bonus, think of more as we can do that,
so that's
but it's more of a short term.
Okay.
Short term.
Okay.
Maybe matter of months or maybe a couple years.
Stick around 2 years and here's 10 grand type of a thing?
Yeah.
Okay.
Right. Whereas the medium and long term, so in your example for the new owner, probably wants more of a medium and long term incentive plan.
Absolutely.
To say, stay here until you retire, or for the next 10 years,
right.
or what have you.
Until I pay off the loan on this business I bought. Yeah.
Right. That's right.
Okay.
So bonus plans are, that's, I guess if I were to put this in order of simplicity to complexity, those tend to be more on the simple side.
Okay.
It's not to say that it doesn't take energy to set them up, but in terms of the, what's involved, they tend to be sort of at the more simple end.
Okay.
Next, we go to what we call SERPs. This is Supplemental Executive Retirement Plan. This is a form of non-qualified deferred compensation. Some people are familiar with that term.
Yep.
A SERP is basically the employer will say, we're going to offer X. And it could be, in fact, we have an example of this that we'll get into later.
Okay.
So I don't want to go too deep on that, but that's kind of maybe the next rung
on
the ladder. This, again, is a medium and long-term strategy. Then we go on to phantom stock. Some people have heard of that. Basically, the idea here is we want to try to mimic the stock. So some call it synthetic equity or phantom equity.
Okay.
So we're trying to say is help grow the stock of the company, and without giving them stock, we give them something that looks like stock but isn't.
Okay. So they are in effect being compensated for the upward performance of the company without giving up any ownership of it. Right?
That's correct.
Okay.
Yep. And then we have another plan called stock appreciation rights, or SAR. Some people call them SARs. And these are similar to phantom stock. It's a similar idea. It's like stock options, but it's not stock options.
Okay.
So it's the growth of the stock. And so as we get to the bottom here, phantom stock and stock appreciation rights, those are more on the more sophisticated, more complex. There are lots of different things that you have to design within that. So another part of the message with this, Dan, is that these plans, again, range from fairly simple to very sophisticated.
Okay.
And each client's situation is different. And some companies, they have a penchant for complexity, and others do not, and would just as soon keep it simple.
Sure.
And so we'll get into some of the scale factors as well, about who do these plans fit for, and who can set them up, and that type of thing.
Okay.
But I guess the message here is that there are different camps, and within those camps, there's a range of simplicity and complexity.
So we don't need a PhD to put together a handcuff plan for somebody.
That's correct.
Okay.
And in our experience, most small and lower mid-market companies, they tend not to want to do the super complex ones, because at the end of the day, if nobody understands it, or it's a real burden to put in place, it doesn't really solve the problem.
Okay. And maybe I'll stop too and say, just if you have questions as Scott's presenting here, please enter those into our Q&A box as they come to you, and we'll try to take them as we go. Otherwise, you can save some for the end. We should have a few minutes at the end as well. So
okay, great. Up next, the uses. So we've spoken a little bit about this already, but to be a little more straightforward about it, there really are 4 uses for these types of plans in our experience. The first one, of course, is to incentivize employees, and that's to drive company or individual performance, or both. And likewise, then, to grow the value of the company. For example, it could be sales growth, Dan. It could be revenue. It could be profit. It could be whatever metric you can imagine, as long as it's measurable and everyone understands what the measurement is. It can be driven, and a plan can be built around.
Okay. Have you seen things that are, the obvious one is sales growth, I think, for me, but have you seen things that deal more with what I would call operational type of metrics, or, efficiencies and things like that, where you want to keep an operations manager involved and they have no control over sales growth?
Yes. Now, with operations folks, it can get a little more difficult to manage some of those things, because then you get into, if they're cutting costs.
Sure.
What is there some unintended consequence that could drive.
Okay.
So it can be done.
Mhm.
It's a little more difficult with
Okay.
that type of employee or position.
Okay.
Generally, I would say most times it might be a function of sales. It could be a function of revenue. It could be a function of profitability. It could be a function of EBITDA.
Okay.
It could be a function of new client acquisition. So there's
Okay.
a host of things. Again, basically, if it's measurable and the company determines that it will help them drive what they're looking
It's
to
a healthy
drive.
measurement.
Yep. And everybody's clear about how to measure it and where the data comes from, then we can build a plan around it for the most part. The reward function, along with that, largely these plans are around supplemental retirement benefits, but they don't have to be. We've seen, for example, here we have in parentheses education and student loan repayment. So we're finding, for example, the student loan repayment for a millennial generation, that's more compelling to them than some retirement benefit at 65, for example, or 60.
I mean, the average student debt coming out of school is in the low 20,000s or something like that.
Right.
So I could see that being a big one.
Yeah. And then also the cost of education on the other side of that is, providing supplemental funds for education for children. So again, we can largely, it's for retirement and long-term reward, but the reward could be tied to or aligned with some other outcome that's relevant to the
More
employee.
relevant to them. When you say education, you mean the education of the employee themselves, or are we talking about
of their children?
Really?
Yeah.
So we might be incentivizing them with a carrot that includes part of that carrot is helping their kids go to college, or
it's possible that we can arrange a distribution from a plan or a vesting that just happens to tie to their child's 19th birthday.
Okay, interesting.
So, not to get too deep into the weeds on this, but, the plan would generally not say something like, we're going to educate your children.
Sure.
But it might create windows of income or vesting
timing
that
when
align
they need
with
it.
those things. Right.
And I can see that being very powerful psychologically as a parent myself, thinking about paying for education of my children, that might be even more meaningful than just dollars in my pocket or whatever.
Or a supplemental retirement.
Sure.
Again, largely these plans tend to surround themselves or these are focused on retirement, but they don't have to be.
Sure.
That's the point here.
Sure. Okay.
And then also this idea of collateral or down payment potentially for business buy-in at some point.
Okay.
So, and I know we'll talk about this a little bit more, and there you have some other webinars coming up that are going to touch on this.
We do. Yep.
This idea of utilizing some of these plans as perhaps a stepping stone or a base, a foundation for buying into the business. It can be structured, and the vesting can be tied to a time frame around that as well.
Right.
So
we're going to be covering some of that next month with our series. Okay, great.
Right. Retain. Typically, there's some type of vesting schedule or time event. It could be an age. It could be a number of years, or it could be a vesting schedule. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. It can be a defined amount or a benefit at a certain point in time. So as I mentioned, it could coincide with someone's retirement age or their child's college education start, or that second home that you plan on buying in Arizona someday.
Yeah, right. Absolutely.
Also, there tends to be, along with these plans, as one might imagine, some sort of non-compete or non-solicitation or risk of forfeiture element.
So there's a give and take element there.
There is.
Okay.
There is. And that's an important part of the retain feature that does go with these types of plans.
Okay.
That the owners are generally, very interested in.
Sure, absolutely.
And for good reason.
And on the vesting, I've heard the term rolling vesting. You want to maybe just share with us what that is real quick?
Sure. Rolling vesting is, some people call it class vesting. So basically, think of it like this. there's a certain amount of money that's going to be set aside at some point, and there's a vesting schedule that's applied to that.
Yeah.
And rolling vesting would mean that every year a certain percentage of that initial contribution would vest.
Okay.
And then the second year, another contribution is made, and a certain percentage of that contribution is vesting.
Okay.
And so you essentially what it
each side
creates is this, I call it the snowball effect.
Sure.
It's that every year the vesting number and interest generally, or whatever the metric is, continues to grow.
Okay.
And I'll get into this in a couple more slides where we talk about one of our examples, but that's become a very common way for people to see that if the employees are going to walk away, they're walking away from a growing snowball of money that, it creates a compelling reason for them to stay.
So the longer I stay, the harder it is to leave.
Correct.
Is that basically what we're talking about here?
That's right.
And those are the kind of employees we want to keep anyway, the ones that are staying with us longer and longer, I suppose.
That's right. Exactly.
Okay. Thanks, Scott.
Sure. And then lastly, transfer. Again, we touched on this a little bit, but these plans can be structured so that there's a coincidence of vesting or resources available to create a down payment or perhaps a buy-in. And again, I think you have some bank folks that are going to talk about that. We find, again, that these golden handcuff plans can be structured with that as one of the thoughts in mind, that it could be down payment money someday, which is outside of the bounds of today's discussion, but can be one of the real challenges with succession and exit planning, as you know, around if it's an internal transfer, where do the resources come from, or can they get financing to buy in? And so these plans can be used in concert. So in a way, they can be a little bit like a Swiss Army knife in that there are multiple uses for them.
Okay.
And then lastly, the stay bonus through transition or sale, just making sure that the key employees, if there is a transition, keeping them on board through that transition becomes really critical. Again, because otherwise the next buyers will say, well, this company's not as valuable if a lot of our main relationship managers just left, or the people that run the operation are no longer here. So transfer becomes a really critical thing as well.
Okay.
There are some other things to consider naturally. And also, this is maybe one part disclaimer, which we'll get to in the last slide, but also a recognition that this is kind of a team sport, as I like to think of it.
Okay.
So usually,
similar to football,
just
like you
like
and
football,
Kurt hanging out, right?
That's right. You got it.
Okay.
So tax, legal, and financial folks generally are involved in these things. There are functions for all of them to perform. We certainly, don't give tax or legal advice. There's also can be a risk management element for the business that relates to death and disability functions, which also is outside the bounds of our discussion today. But suffice it to say that can come into play with these plans as well.
Okay.
This opportunity cost to the business if they leave, we've already kind of broached that. That's one of the reasons that people are very interested in these plans. And then one of the things we haven't touched on is what I call the psychological boost for the employees. Being in these meetings, typically it starts with the ownership and the other advisors. And we're kind of building a plan that says, okay, what are we trying to accomplish here? And when we get to the point where, like, yes, we're going to do something and this is what we plan to do, and then we get the employees involved. And usually there's a meeting in the boardroom or the owner's office, and it gets into, this is what we want to do and here's why. And being able to explain to the employees, or be in the meeting where the owners are explaining to the employees why they're doing this. We've literally had people that, usually this comes out of the blue for the employees.
Okay.
And so imagine if I came to you today, Dan, and said, I'm the founder, Frank, and you're our key employee. And I said, Dan, you're important to us and we want to reward and retain you. And here's what we're going to do on top of all the other things that you already have.
Sure.
We're not taking anything away. This is just additive. Okay. Like, you can imagine that you're going to be like, wow.
Yeah,
like,
absolutely.
And literally I've had people thanking me, which,
Sure.
like, we're just a vessel to help make this happen. But there's this can be really powerful psychological boost to the employees. And And for example, when we're talking about not equity, but non-equity, right?
Yeah, right.
They're not getting a piece of the company, but what they take from it is this additional vested interest.
Sure.
It feels like they want to go higher and do more for the company. And that is a really cool thing to experience.
Right. They
and
like
it's
me.
real.
They really like me, right?
That's right. And I'm important to the company, and there's a recognition of that. And, there's going to be something in it for you as well. So there's just this,
Kind of
that's one of the cool things that we get to experience as we do this.
I'm sure there's studies maybe done that show that there's a bump in production from these folks that are granted and awarded these types of incentives.
There probably is. I don't have the quotes on it, but or the link. But anyway, we think that's an important maybe secondary benefit of this.
Sure.
Also, it can serve as a potential pathway to ownership.
Okay.
Or at least create some options and flexibility for if that is the case. And if ownership is not the case, again, we think that it's going to make sense to reward and retain these folks anyway through transition.
Okay.
Okay. People always want to know, well,
how much?
What is it going to cost me, right?
Right.
And so our disclaimer here is that this can be all over the board. And so, but we wanted to just give kind of a range to say that I think the message here is that there's definitely some startup costs.
Okay.
So think of these maybe more as one-time startup costs to get these plans established.
Okay.
And largely those are professional fees, consultants, tax, legal. And so this is our experience, probably $4,000 to $6,000. If it's a smaller company and maybe they're only doing, 1 or 2 or 3 people, it might be a little less than that.
Okay.
If it's a big company and they're doing a lot of folks, then there might be some additional, nuances that come into play.
Sure.
So it could be a little more. But so startup is kind of one piece. And then depending on the plan and all the nuances, many times we're using a third-party administrator that specializes in these things. And so there's some ongoing administrative costs.
Okay.
People don't have to do that, but it could be internal or it could be with the accounting firm. But there is some ongoing, making sure people are reminded that this is what you have and here's how it works, and who do you want as a beneficiary and that type of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And then probably the biggest determination is really this, what we call annual cash flow, and that's generally, this doesn't have to be done, but many times in our experience, especially with smaller companies, they like to reserve or escrow money somewhere aside so that they've got the assets to provide these benefits when the time comes. They don't have to do that. They can just do it out of cash flow. But again, we find that both the employer and the employee tend to feel better if there is a plan in place that says, because essentially what they're doing is the employees, like the company's making a promise to them.
Absolutely.
And so then they become essentially an unsecured creditor of the company for whatever this promise is. And so in our experience, typically they will somehow reserve, money aside. And that function very largely is determined on the size of the company, how many key employees they have, and they want to, provide these types of golden handcuffs to. And so this is a really wide range, but we've had cases where it might be $4,000 for a couple people. All the way up to, we have some where, there's 50 or more employees and they're doing a lot. And so the point again here is our main limitations are imagination. And the size of the company really drives a lot of these numbers, which is generally a function of head count or how many people that, they're covering with these types of plans.
Okay. So if I think about this as a smaller firm, I've got these setup costs around $5,000 and some ongoing costs I may or may not have. If I try to the do-it-yourself model, maybe there is some of that going on. I don't know. But then from the cash flow standpoint, what we're talking about is funding the handcuffs, correct? And how much do we need to have in order to make something work? And you're saying you could do something with as little as $4,000 or $5,000 a year.
That's correct.
Okay. Mm-hmm. And so we might be setting aside and doing escrow, if I think of it similar to a mortgage, where we've got an account set up or something and we're dumping $400 or $500 a month into that account. Is that kind of what you're talking about?
Yeah.
Here?
So again, for today's purposes, we're not getting into what all the nuances of
Well, let's
that
keep
are.
it simple.
But largely, the point is, if you're going to make a promise, if I'm founder Frank and you're my key employee, and I'm making a promise to you
Yeah.
based on some metric that we determine, and that the company's going to pay you X at a certain point in time, then we think it makes good business sense to set money aside for that promise. And you'll feel better about that, and we will also feel better about it. And any buyer that comes in will also feel better that there's been some reserving done
Sure.
for that. And so that tends to be, it doesn't have to be done that way,
Okay.
but in our experience, it almost always is.
Is that shown to the employee over the course of the year or otherwise? So if I'm the employee and founder Frank, I trust you, but I only trust you so much. Are you really putting money into this thing? And am I really going to see it at the end of the year? How do you overcome some of that trust factor?
Yeah, that's a great question.
Okay.
First of all, no, they generally do not see what the company is choosing to use to escrow money.
Okay.
And Frank, they have no rights to it generally.
Okay.
So it's really just more of I guess it's a goodwill thing.
Sure.
And we think smart business.
Yeah.
If you're going to make a promise for something, that make sure that, especially if it becomes a big promise over time, that you're, squirreling away some cash
protecting it.
to cover it. So.
Okay. Thanks.
Sure.
I do see a question here, and maybe we could take this from Jim right now. Any thoughts on determining where to draw the line on key employees? Can't afford it for everyone, but don't want to create moral problems with employees that don't meet the key status. I think that's a great question, Jim. So what he's getting at there is, I do it for Sally and Bobby, but I don't do it for Jimmy. Now Jimmy's going to be PO'd at me a little bit, right? Yeah,
it is a great question. The answer is always, it depends.
Help us a little bit.
Each company's situation is a little bit different. I should also say there does, and we do speak to this, there does tend to be, a confidentiality arrangement around this.
Okay.
That this is not, for everybody to know about. Generally, the folks that do know about it are tax and legal counsel, any financial or consulting counsel, the ownership group, and usually CFO or controller or whoever is, going to have to, be involved in keeping track of this type of thing. And largely those folks are covered by these plans as well. And if they're not, and you're putting them on someone else, it's generally a good idea to include them in the plan. Okay. But the second part of the question, or maybe the deeper part, is it's really up to the owner. Again, I think we put highly compensated in quotes. We generally think of it as maybe the top 25% in terms of compensation, those would be the folks that you generally would consider. But we do have times where maybe they're not in that camp, but the reality of their role or what they're doing is such that if something happened or you need to put that glue in their seat, that maybe they're not in that top category by income, but they certainly are by responsibility and role.
That could be a function of tenure with the firm.
Could be tenure, right? And so you do have to be careful. There can be a little bit of an HR function with who you decide to put these on. Mm-hmm. And I guess what I would say is, if a company's concerned about, will someone else find out about this? And if they're key, but we're not doing it on them, for them,
right,
then that's really management's call. I guess if you're concerned that they might leave if they find out, then you maybe should have something for them too. Or do something for them that, will appease
one
them.
Tool that you can use is a confidentiality agreement that you have key employee Sally signed, saying you will not share this information with others within or outside the firm, or any one type of a thing.
Yeah, generally legal counsel would work on that.
Okay. Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So how are we doing for time? We're doing okay. We've got a couple more slides. We'll keep going.
Yep, absolutely.
So we went through the costs.
Yep. And
I think we got that. So the point there is that these can be done for small companies. They can be done for large companies. And frankly, our experience is the large companies, most of them have some form of this. They have something that's how they reward and retain their companies or employees. And if we were to go to, we work with corporate folks too. So if we were to go to large companies, they're using tools like this, deferred compensation. They may have stock options or restricted stock units.
Yeah.
This is in large companies, public companies, they do this all day long. So we're really, I think our audience is more small and
Absolutely.
lower level mid-market companies.
Yep.
So we're just kind of taking some of these same concepts and doing it on a smaller scale.
Correct.
That's what it comes down to. So here's an example. I use the SERP as our example. This is, it's relatively straightforward. So the employer provides some additional benefits to key employees, generally around retirement. The older plans, I call these the old-fashioned plans. These tended to work with baby boomers and previous generations, and they really were designed to kind of look like pensions, like the old pensions. It says, again, in our example, if I'm founder Frank and you're key employee Dan, I say, Dan, if you stay with us until you retire at age 65, we're going to give you some extra income. And this is on top of your Social Security and pension and 401k and such. But if you don't, if you leave before age 65, then all bets are off.
And you get nothing.
You get nothing.
Okay.
If you stay, you get $2,000 a month for 15 years.
All right.
So that's a pretty big incentive to stay.
Sure,
right?
absolutely.
But as you can imagine, Dan, that doesn't work for everyone, for all generations.
Just seems too simple.
For all companies.
Yeah.
Well,
all right.
There are multiple issues around it.
Okay.
Today, we're seeing more of the plans we do today are kind of the next generation plans, are structured more like what we call defined contribution. So we're gonna pick some metric. It might be a percentage of their salary, which is fairly common.
Okay.
It might be a percentage of the sales number that they drive. It might be a percentage of growth in revenue. Whatever the metric is that's determined, it's variable basically, based on what happens.
Okay.
So rather than the old-fashioned plans rewarding you for just sitting and coming to work every day until you're 65,
sure.
We don't care what the performance is. Just keep breathing.
Yeah.
Now it's much more around performance and metrics.
Great.
Right?
So we're putting them on the same side of the table as ourselves.
Exactly.
Okay.
So again, it could be a percentage of base salary, or it could be a key performance indicator that the owner wants to drive.
And you're saying a percentage of base comp is a common one.
It is.
How does that look then? 10%, 15, 20? I get it depends, but for our audience, is a number like a common one is it 10%, or is where does it need to be meaningful enough?
So we have we've seen them designed around, sometimes it's, and again, not to go too deep into the weeds on this, sometimes they might be limited in their 401k plan.
Okay. Yep.
And so it can be designed to make up for some of those limitations.
Okay.
We've done that before.
Okay.
Or it could be 10%, or it could be a variable percentage based on other things. So I would say, if I had to draw a rule of thumb, 10 to 20 is not outside of the realm of possibilities.
Okay.
And we've done many of them like that before.
And
but
then
it doesn't have to be.
And then you slap on a performance metric to that 10 to 20% that could look like year-over-year sales growth of at least 2% or
correct
5%,
or the metric could be a function of sales or revenue, and then depending, it could have breakpoints, if you will, that says if we get to this level, then we're going to do 10%.
Okay.
If we get to this level this year, we're going to do 15%.
Sure.
So again, our main limitation is our imagination and how much bandwidth people have for complexity. So that can be good and bad.
Okay.
Right?
Okay.
And so then we also, then there's usually a vesting schedule. So back to the snowball effect, that the longer they're here, the more contributions get made. Now all of a sudden, with this type of plan, Dan, as founder Frank, I come to you and I say, hey, Dan, this plan your vested portion is $250,000. Thank you. And good job. And next year, based on our, it'll be this. And you're going to get a statement that reminds you of that.
Perfect.
That says, don't forget, Dan,
Before you get on
if you walk out of here,
send your resume somewhere, take a look at this statement type of thing.
Right.
Huh? Okay.
Right. So there's, you can just see in these differences from kind of the old plans to the new plans. The new plans are more complicated, and that's why there's some administrative costs, of course.
Mm-hmm.
But we think they're also much more effective in
Sure.
putting glue in the seats of the key employees, and also helping the ownership drive the performance things that they want to drive for the company.
Okay.
And again, typically there's some sort of non-compete, solicitation, and a risk of forfeiture. That generally is standard with this type of thing. And then again, it can be done with a couple of employees or dozens of employees. I think we've got, on the bookends, we have our smaller plans are 2 or 3 people,
Mm-hmm.
and our largest one I think might be 50 or 60 employees.
Okay.
So again, that largely is a function of the size of the company and how many employees they have, which also tends to be directly correlated to how much revenue they do and that type of thing.
Yep.
So it can be small or large, simple or complex, lots of funding or not much funding.
Sure.
Okay.
How do we keep Scott around? Well, we have to give Kurt Warner some snaps right now, though we know that Scott is the promising future here for us, right? How do we keep him happy?
Exactly.
Okay.
That's exactly right.
Okay.
Good analogy.
I gotcha.
Okay. So I think we've got a little bit time left for
Mm-hmm.
another question or two.
Absolutely. Bring those in. If you've got questions, please type those in. This has been great, Scott. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it helps us get a handle on the fact that, these aren't just for large companies. And if you're thinking that way, you're going to lose your good employees to larger companies, right? And so how can we do something that's maybe a little more simplified but accomplishes the same thing? We absolutely can do that, it sounds like.
For sure. And to that point, Dan, the large companies, the very large companies, they all do this. It's like a standard operating procedure, basically.
Okay.
And we have had some clients who basically have installed these types of plans because as maybe they grew into other markets, maybe they were in one market to start with, and then they went to Des Moines, or they went to Chicago, or they opened offices in other places.
Yeah.
And now the talent that they're competing for, they're competing with public companies,
Sure.
for example, or other larger companies, and they need something else to add to their, they need another arrow in their quiver, if you will, to reward and retain these key performers. And so this becomes a natural part of that conversation. And frankly, it's the plans can be designed so that they're as sophisticated as what the large companies offer. By practice and just practical limitations, they may not necessarily be all as that complicated, or they don't have to be, but they can be. And so I think part of our message today is that if you have a smaller company in Iowa and you're competing with against these other companies, we feel like this is an opportunity to maybe compete with it's like the David and Goliath. If you're competing with large companies, you do have to have these other things in place. This is not a cure-all to end all as far as having people stay until they're 65. There's nothing that can do that, right? So we have to be realistic about that, which is why we spoke about some of the other foundational things that need to be in
having
play.
Just competitive pay and good benefits, right?
Right. But when we layer this on top of those other things, it can be a difference maker. And we have examples where employees we know had other opportunities and chose to stay because of the overall package, and some of that, as well as the vision for the future, that there is opportunity, and this can be a part of that.
Okay. So. Well, great. I do want to give a quick shameless plug for our next webinar, which is going to follow on to the one that we did today. So next month, it's I wrote it down here. Let me find it. I think it's April 18th at noon. We're going to be doing our next webinar is going to be on financing a key employee. So what we've talked about here today with Scott has been a lot of the types of things that go into keeping key employees around. And now while we've got our key employee around, maybe they are the one who's going to be a logical buyer for us. And part of becoming a healthy and financeable buyer for us might involve some of these golden handcuff techniques that we've talked about and having those in place. And so starting early and getting that done is something that's going to be key. So if you want to join us on the 18th of April at noon, we're going to be talking about how to finance a key employee with some of this being in it, involved in it. And Scott, one question I had that I got on an email earlier today is in regards to bringing on new employees versus employees that we've already got and have had for a while. When does it make sense? Is it too soon to slap some of these golden handcuffs onto a new sales employee or new CFO coming into the firm right when they get started with us? When should we be thinking about this with new employees that we're bringing on, and so that it's not too late, so that we have it?
Yeah, that's a great question. And in general, I think of it as unless it's part of a recruitment incentive package that, this is maybe the last thing that has to be in place in order to get them to the company.
Yep.
In our experience, I think it's better if you sort of wait until a honeymoon is over.
Okay.
In other words, because, they may not be the right fit.
Sure.
Or the company may not be the right fit for them. And so I think generally speaking, them being on board for maybe a year or two so that everybody is comfortable that, they're the right fit for the organization would be consistent with our experience.
Okay. And how about a slightly different question related, though, is if you're already paying, let's just say Dan, $100,000 a year for the job they're doing, and now we're talking about I got to throw more money at them. What I'd really like to do is back their pay off a little bit and make them earn it instead, type of a thing. And it seems like, well, it's a little too late for that type of thing. I mean, have you seen that? Yeah. Have you seen that, or how do owners deal with the fact that they think they're already paying plenty enough, and now employee Bob is coming to them wanting more, or whatever it might be?
Yeah, I think that's a tough battle. Probably it's the wrong order. Again, we're not giving them HR advice. Each owner has to make these determinations for themselves. But
Yep.
I do think that it may not work real well to do it that way. That may be a good way to have them leave.
Okay.
And so we think of it, maybe, I guess the only way you could address that, Dan, would be to think of it as, what's the opportunity cost? Maybe the owner feels like they are well compensated, but what's the opportunity cost if they don't stay?
Sure.
And what would that cost be compared to what the cost might be to do something more, whether it's this or something else? I think, that the salary piece, we see this as an adder, not a detractor. So if you're taking something away, that we generally find that not work very well.
Okay.
Two other things real quick.
Yeah.
I've got for the attorneys, we've got a page to show the disclaimers.
Great.
But also,
Let's do that.
We've got a special offer for Advance Iowa participants.
Oh, perfect.
And we're happy to offer a free 30-minute phone consultation to anyone that would like to talk about their circumstances and whether a golden handcuff plan might be a good fit for them or not.
Okay.
And we're offering that here for the next 30 days. And so there's my contact information and our website and email. And so that's a special offer.
Appreciate
for Advance Iowa.
Thank you.
And then this is for the attorneys, our disclaimers.
All right. Maybe we'll leave it on that slide, huh? One thing we didn't talk about was your book either.
Yes. So I did co-author
How to Create Your Life.
How to Create Your Life by Design. That's right. And those are not on Amazon. It's not for sale, but if someone's interested in that, they can reach out to me as well. And we'll be happy to send them a copy. So.
Thank you, Scott. I wish we had one here to show, like David Letterman or something, but I guess I haven't gotten one yet. So anyway,
we'll be happy to send you one.
All right. I appreciate it. Thank you for your time today, Scott. Thank you all for being on with us. Appreciate it. Next month, we'll be talking about how to finance a key employee, if that might be a exit planning strategy you are looking at and thinking, my key employee can't afford to buy me out. there are actually some ways to look at how to do that and do it creatively, especially if you've got time on your side. So I hope you can join us again next month. Thank you, and have a great rest of your day.
So the blue light is off. Does that mean that we're done?
We're done.
Is the recording, the audio is off as well?
Patrick is taking care of all that.
Your audio is still on.
Patrick,
I can hear you.